Baptist Church. I forget his first name, his last name was Reverend Shaw, and talked to him about my project and what I wanted to do. I wanted to meet adolescent parents. And I figured some of them attended this church. And if not, at least teenagers in this community attended this church and would know adolescent parents in this community. And so he introduced me to the head of the youth committee at the church. And then it was all a matter of one lead after another. She introduced me to a young girl who was not a mother, but knew a lot of mothers, adolescent mothers, and adolescent fathers. And it was just a matter then after that of meeting them. And I ended up approaching 22 families, 13 of which came into the project. That was too big. And after a couple of months, I cut it back to 6 families. And those were the 6 families that provided the greatest access. And because I was interviewing everyone in the families. Right.
How willing were people to sort of share kind of the intimate details of their lives? Is that something you could sort of build over time? And did you tell them right away, for example, that I want to use your name in the newspaper, or is that something you would sort of spool out?
No. When I introduced myself, my name is Leon Danson from the Washington Post. I'm looking at teenage pregnancy in this community. And I understand you have, I'm talking to an adolescent mother, and I said, well, the first thing I want to do, if you're interested in participating in this, is meet your parents, or your parents. So everyone was right up on board what I was doing. I understood that when you're dealing with human sexuality, it's a very sensitive issue, it's a very difficult issue to get into among any ethnic group at any social class level, anywhere in the world. But so everyone was clearly understood what I was doing from the outset. When I introduced myself, when they met me, it was the first thing out of my mouth, what I was doing there. And people, what surprised me is that a lot of the people I introduced myself to did not see it as the kind of crisis that I saw it as. Why are you looking at adolescent childbearing? Why is that such a big deal? I use the phrase, in the introductory phase, I use teenage pregnancy. I switched to adolescent childbearing because none of the adolescents in these 6 families was the pregnancy accidental. It was intentional and planned, right? But they lied to me, all of them lied to me at the outset. But
I'm sorry, all of them what?
lied to me about that it was at the
So they
outset.
claimed it was accidental?
They were ignorant of birth control, their body's ability to reproduce, all of that was a lie. It was a lie created for adults. And I was 40. Right? So sell him this bill of goods too. Okay? So on an average, it took 4 to 6 months for anyone who was willing to tell me the truth.
Wow.
Now, remember, I'm interviewing everyone in these 6 families. In 3 of the families, there are 2 parents, and 3 of the families are headed by single women. In every instance, before the adolescent parent was willing to tell me the truth, I already knew the truth. Because I was relying on something that all reporters rely on, and it's universal among human beings, the inability to keep a secret. Everybody violated the confidence that they had given in terms of big sisters, brothers, boyfriends. All of them said, well, you know what her real motivation was in having a baby. I said, no, I don't. One asked me, what did Sheila tell you about having a baby? She said it was an act of God. She said, I hope you don't believe that. I'm going with her first story, but I haven't said, that's ridiculous or anything like that. And he said, well, let me tell you the real reason. And this was her brother. In another instance, it was an older sister who had sat in on the first interview. What I discovered, though, by the second or third interview, that I should not start the interviews with pregnancy. That was very difficult, right? And it was very difficult to get the teenagers talking. So I switched to what I thought was a relatively neutral area. I said, well, let's start this interview process. The first interview we will do will be all about your school history. And we'll start with your earliest childhood memory attending school. All of the teenagers were in high school, so we'll take it right up to the present day. Right? And then after we did that, we did your earliest childhood memory and another interview growing up inside your family. Again, starting with your earliest childhood memory in that area. Then this was a heavily religious community. Evangelicals, various levels of that's the first time I had the expression Goodwill Baptists. I didn't know what that was, you know. I just thought Baptists were Baptists. But so the third interview would be your earliest childhood memory growing up in church. And the fourth interview would be your earliest childhood memory growing up outside the family. And then when we reach adolescence and puberty, we begin talking about sexuality. By this time, this is the fourth interview now. Now I was stood up a lot because I was not a priority in the teenagers' lives. So there was always one interview a week with 10 interviews, with 10 separate, well, there were 10 separate adolescent parents in the project, but always one interview a week over these 4 interviews pattern. So I would plan to be able to complete 4 interviews in a month, but often it was 6 weeks, 7 weeks, because I was stood up a lot. But luckily, whenever I was stood up, when I showed up at the teenager's house, remember I was interviewing everyone in the family. So if she or he stood me up, then I would start to complete an interview with someone in the family that I had already started. And that was how the process went on. And eventually, usually classically, using this model, between the third interview and the fourth interview, contradictions begin to appear. Contradictions about what they've already told you, right? So, and then you can, after you finish these 4, you can go right into the contradictions. So sometimes I did a total of 12, 14, 15 interviews with teenagers, particularly after they began telling me the truth, after they had voluntarily removed their public mask. And that was how the process worked.
Okay, this is for anybody up on the panel. You are all doing these very intimate stories about issues that no one's proud of, so to speak. Do you have any special techniques for cross-generational, cross-racial, cross-gender, for getting these people, unlike yourself, to open up? Because I was impressed by you being able to talk to a teenager, and you could literally be her father at that point. And what techniques do you guys use to cross those barriers?
I think there's one significant element in all of this intimate journalism, and that is time, which a lot of media outlets don't have today, so don't give reporting. Time overcomes a lot of barriers, and there were 2 barriers that I had to overcome with the adolescents. That was that I was middle class and 40. And I was very nervous. I'm running around this neighborhood with teenage girls, and I'm waiting for somebody to accuse me of being a pedophile. So, you know, I was very cautious about everything that I was doing, because I spent a lot of time, ate a lot of fast food.
I think one thing that helps a lot, and you're right, and so I'm very middle class, you know, white, and, you know, actually I'm upper middle class probably, and so I am meeting people who, you know, might be very suspicious of me. So one, I think, is the introduction, you know, how you sort of get to them. And I've found that, you know, the most useful, obviously a lot of the nonprofits are great, but also I find that there's, you know, there's some character usually in the community who's really down in the streets. And one of the most successful stories I think I did was working with this guy in, his name is David Ross, who works with the homeless in San Diego. And he's kind of crazy, quite frankly, and all of the nonprofits and everybody kind of dismiss him, but he is out, they call him Waterman Dave, because he is out in the street every single night for years, on his own, just giving water to homeless people in the city, and everybody there knows him. And I just sort of stumbled upon his name, and I I contacted him, and he goes, oh, I'll take you out. And we spent nights out in the streets, and he introduced me to everybody and just, said, this is Pam, you can trust her. These people never in a million years probably would have talked to me. But it was great, and people just poured out. I'm just amazed at how much people will tell me and just completely open up and share their stories. But I think it was like kind of that introduction. And I think the second thing was, I think people know that I really care. And I spend a lot of time just listening to people. I'm kind of a naturally empathetic person. I think that helps. And I just listen, and I think that comes through. It's served me well. I just listen. I let them tell us stories, and I'm not judgmental. Obviously, I have to ask them. I very much try and cover, the good and the bad of poverty, because as we all find out very quickly, it's a combination of bad luck, bad circumstances, but also a lot of bad choices. And I feel very strongly about that. You have to cover all of that. But I think it's the introduction is that.
Yeah, I would agree with sort of both points. I once had an editor put it this way: you have to have the ability to kind of sit still in the story. Sort of, if you have that subject and you're introduced, you just have to have a way of listening and not being judgmental and almost just waiting for things to develop. You can't always want to fill the silence and things like that. You just have to sort of kind of wait for things to reveal themselves in a way, and that takes time, and that's a luxury I'm sure many of us in this room don't have.
It's like having teenagers and the only place they'll talk to you is in the car.
You just have to be there.
You can get a source in the car with you, especially if you can get them driving so you can take notes. That tends to really.
Yeah, don't be the wheel.
Yeah.
And I learned a lot, in this project I learned a lot of the lyrics of the songs, because I didn't understand the songs. And I would play their tapes, and my tape, when we were going one place or another, and they would explain what was being said. But they both made the point, both Pam and Michael and Beth, thank you, made the point that about not being judgmental. If you're doing this kind of interviewing, you notice right away that people miss the content of the question. I'm in a relatively neutral area. I'm talking about school history. This is the first interview I'm doing. And they miss the content of the question, and you have to repeat the question. Why? Because they're focused on the inflections in your voice. And they're watching your eyes with great intensity to see if you are judgmental. And if you are, it shows up in your eyes first. And pretty soon, even if the content of your question is neutral, the inflection of your voice sends a signal. So your voice has to be flat and conversational, like you're holding a conversation. And you can't have a judgmental look in your eyes. And that's what's happening. They're missing the content of the question in the beginning of the process because they're looking for that. You are from another world, another planet. And what do you think about me? And people are not, the interviewer is in a very powerful position. This is all voluntary. But people are not going to sit and tell you the truth if you're going to judge them. They're going to tell you what they think you want to hear, rather than something closer to the truth.
And a lot of our work, the Foundation's work, is in foster care and juvenile justice. And when you are talking to children who are in these systems, that level of trust is an essential element, just to be able to form trust. And it does take time. Because if you talk to someone who has been through many systems and going from one home to another, they don't have anyone they feel they can depend on. They look at anyone else having control over their lives, and they have little control, and they see you as an outsider who's just ready to send them to their next destination without necessarily their best interest at heart. It takes a lot of time to get to know and trust those individuals. So I think that I would just echo everything that's been said here, is that just not being judgmental about these children, because one of the things that's important to a lot of work we do when we advocate for policy and practices, and we look at families in poverty and try to look at better outcomes, what will drive better outcomes. We don't care how someone ended up in the situation they're in. A child had no choice to decide which family to be born into. So whatever decisions their parents made really are irrelevant. What matters now is that you have children who are, and that's our niche. Our niche is to work with children in poverty, child welfare, juvenile justice, and to make sure that we understand their stories and help tell their stories, and help reporters tell their stories as well as possible, without coming to them from a judgmental frame.
I want to add too that the foundation he works for, the Annie E. Casey Foundation, was for me very helpful in terms of providing me with the money to go on leave to write a book on a woman in the underclass, Rosalie Cunningham. And so they're a great resource. Now you'll probably get a flood of requests. But they were very, very helpful and understood what I was trying to do. And that's not the case with every plugger you go to who's you're trying to get support. So you can go on leave without pay to write a book about this underclass family, and people are saying, well, why do you want to do that? Well, they weren't at the Annie E. Casey Foundation. They didn't ask me that. They said, come on over to our headquarters in Baltimore and let's talk. Yeah. Very different approach.
Can you talk a little more now about the kind of resources that you guys offer reporters? I mean, whether it's, data or, connecting them with social service groups on the ground, or what kinds of things can you help us with?
Okay. Well, every year we publish the Kids Count Data Book. I have just a few copies up front right there. Sorry I didn't bring nearly enough for this audience, but I'll give
Do
you
you
my
post
contact
anything
information.
online?
Yes.
On your website?
Yes, it is online, so you can access the data book at www.aecf.org. So that is our signature publication. We also have just expanded that beginning this year. So we are issuing what we call policy reports on issues affecting children in our niche areas. The first one we did was a report on children living in areas of concentrated poverty. That was just a data snapshot, but everything that we do, all of our reports are have intensive data. So there's a lot of data, particularly state-based data. We tend to rank states to show how states are doing by their children. So you will see comparisons among many different categories. So for each of the topics that we use, we make sure that we have state-based data for those areas. We also did a report on kinship care. The president, Olympia Snow, Oprah Winfrey are all people who grew up in kinship care. They were raised by someone other than their parents. And there are 2.7 million children growing up in kinship care, which some people, all of us knew that, and it was not any real surprise. But when we look at the support that kinship caregivers have, we found that it's lacking. And so what our report advocates is for state policies and practices that will provide more support, even in this environment. And this environment is still critical that the children get the essential support they need. And then the data book, we just published that in July. In October, we will publish a report on unemployed youth, which I encourage you to look for. And if you give me your cards, I'll make sure that you get a heads up when that comes out. We'll probably do a webinar in advance of the report, so I will make sure that you will participate if you'd like to. And then we're going to do another one on juvenile justice at the end of the year, which will be, again, just a quick snapshot of what's happening with juvenile justice. So that's essentially the core of what we do. But we also support a number of other organizations that provide research. We support state fiscal analysis organizations, organizations like the Center for Law and Social Policy, the Center for the Study of Social. There's a whole list of organizations that we support that are doing work that focus on improving the lives of children and their families, because you can't really support children without their families. So we do believe in a two-generation approach that we have to support both. So, and of course, we are a proud sponsor of NPR, so you may hear the tagline.
For your information, Annie E. Casey was the mother of the founder of UPS, and lots of money. Go.
Yes.
Speaking of data, I mean, in terms of making reporting more efficient and that pre-reporting that Todd talked about, I mean, obviously busy reporters use data and good research to hone their story angle so that if you don't have, you can't interview 22 families, you can tune your reporting a little better. So I would just be interested though in your, each of the panelists, how you use data in your reporting, at what point in the process you find it most useful.
I find it very important to me in the beginning because I want to understand the ramifications. I look at a lot of demographics. If I identify a social phenomenon that I'm interested in, I look at a lot of demographics before I start embark on a project. Because the people that I approach, I want them to fit inside that demographic, right? I don't want to be reporting outside the demographic. Also, in doing this kind of reporting, I moved away from the kind of reporting that I had always done, that is to interview the experts first. Now, I only interview the experts after I'm done, when I'm getting ready to write. Because I felt, whether subtly or overtly, that the experts were putting me in a box.
Yeah, interesting.
And I reported inside that box, and I didn't want to. And so I wanted to go in it as ignorant as possible, and all of my questions be open-ended. And I found that when I went to interview the experts, they ended up interviewing me. And I said, no, I'm here to interview you. No. What did you find? And what is this? And what, because I'm not putting down experts, but they do more surveys. And they're quick. They're like the reporter on a deadline. They're quick surveys, a lot of questions that they ask, and they don't engage the person. They look down. I teach this methodology now at the University of Illinois. And the graduate students from other disciplines take it because it's cross-listed. When they go out on an assignment, they're writing down questions. And I say, you don't have to write down any questions. Don't write down any questions. I want you to look the person in the eye, have your digital recorder right there. After a while, the digital recorder will disappear for both of you. But you need to be engaged with this person, and you don't do the traditional academic process of writing down a list of questions, because you're just going to go from one question to the other, and you're not going to learn anything. You went to school. Why do you need a list of questions to interview somebody about their school history? You grew up in a family. Why do you need a list of questions to interview somebody about growing up in their family? Your question should be based on what the person has told you.
I would say I pretty much agree, do exactly the same with it. You need the data as sort of the launching pad for your story. I think the other thing that's good with the data is, and also talking to experts, no matter what family you find, say you focus on one family or maybe 3 families or 4 families, nobody's ever going to be the perfect example to illustrate, and you kind of have to know what the things are that they don't actually represent, and so that you can kind of use the data to fill in those gaps, because no family epitomizes,
The perfect demographic.
Exactly. I've tried, but
Yeah, so
it never works. It never works. And then the one thing, basically, and this I have to again give credit to my editor. I'm always trying to, in my pieces, trying to put in a little statistics here and there, or an expert at the end. He's like, get rid of it. He says, you're the expert. Get rid of the experts. Or these people, at the end of the story, after you really reported it, I mean, he just jettisons everything. He jettisons all of the, as I say, my stories have no facts in them. They're just good, other than maybe just one introduction. But you have to know what the data is to be able to do that.
User experience.
Yeah. Yes.
I was wondering if I could ask everyone on the panel maybe some guidance on something that came up in my reporting, but I'm not sure how I would approach someone to get this story, and I've certainly described the story as kind of touchy. So for the past year, I've had an Alicia Patterson Fellowship, and I was looking at the finances of the unbanked, but also financial literacy, and the way it's sometimes tainted by lenders, particularly predatory lenders. So 3 things came up. And the first was I was talking to Rent-A-Center's PR guy, and he sort of slips in there Rental Center pays ministers to go into the churches in New York City and talk about financial literacy. Okay, so later during the course of recording during the year, this guy who's a consultant for Jumpstart, which teaches financial literacy to the nation's high schoolers and provides materials, it's a nonprofit in DC. He sort of slips in somewhere in the course of the interview that GMAC, which is a lender, I think Michael Hudson has written a lot of lawsuits about, subprime lender or auto lender, they pay him to go into churches and talk about financial literacy. So the third thing that happens is I worked with AU's investigative reporting workshop last summer. So we spent a lot of time in Prince George's County. We were writing about the aftermath of the fallout of the financial crisis. We felt it was underreported, the number of subprime loans, the marketing that was done out there. What were homeowners' attitudes now? Okay, so in the course of reporting this, we go to housing fairs, we're spending time, we're in somebody's house as it's being, a realtor's going through it, it's going to be sold in short sale. And they start telling us, one of the aftermath is that now people don't trust lenders. There's a greater mistrust than there was before, so they're going to churches to get financial literacy. They're getting financial literacy from the pastors. And oh, by the way, everybody knows that one of the mega churches in Prince George's encouraged, during the height of housing boom, encouraged its members to take out subprime loans and donate the money to the church for a big building fund.
Well,
Okay, so now I've got all this stuff, okay?
I'm waiting on.
What do I do? Oh, wait, let me add, the third thing is that the big Wells Fargo lawsuit that the NAACP had filed and then quietly went away with the settlement, you know, where they put a financial literacy center in downtown DC, that's how they settled it. That had in there that the pastors in Prince George's were paid $300 for each parishioner they referred for a subprime loan to Wells Fargo.
oh, this is a great.
That's the story. I like the story.
What about you, Peter? I mean, I know, write the story, but I mean, would I go to each pastor? I mean, who's going to sit down? I mean, do I go to a pastor?
Ask if you could go, first of all, to one of the informational sessions and just see if it's this benign thing or, you know, are they passing out the cards and you have the $300, but how much are the other people getting?
And the parishioners, were the parishioners the ones who said that they were encouraged to
Right,
get
and I
the
talked back,
subprime?
I called them back because we were starting to do, this was, you know, after the story had been done. And he kind of said, well, I know the name, but maybe it really didn't happen. You know, it was kind of a little bit of backpedaling, and I wasn't, at that point I was on another story, and if I had gone back out there, I think to hang out more face to face, which is probably what we need to do. I'll get more stuff, but you know how we're done with the one story, we're moving on to
Did the parishioners realize that they were given subprime loans? They don't know.
that they didn't know at the time, they didn't know.
They know now.
Right, because the lawsuit, it is in the lawsuit, there was a whistleblower who was working for
and
Wells Fargo.
Why can't you go to the parishioners to begin gathering the data?
But yeah, I mean, I have to figure out which ones took out the Wells Fargo.
You know everybody's going to be very upset with you.
Right.
That's what, you just grab your shield and your sword and go after it. And go through it. But I would start with the parishioners.
Okay.
As many as I could find. And I don't see these as rushed interviews. You have to walk them through that because of their relationship or non-relationship. You don't know what the case is with the pastor.
Right.
Right.
You're asking them to sort of tell on their pastor.
Yeah, you have to be sort of very even toned in that. And some will may be very angry with the pastor and have left the church. That's great, because they can really give you a lot of detail, and they will. And it's detail that you can use with the parishioners who are still in the church. Remember, who are still in the church. Well, is this the case, and is that the case, and did you sign this? And did he really say this particular company? And I don't understand, these companies, with this financial literacy, these companies doing this the motivation is to get people to sign contracts. And they're paying the ministers to come into their church to do that?
Yeah, to refer people to them. Or
Oh,
let them in.
I know, $300 a person, but even the initial session, to get access to the members of the church, they pay the minister for that?
That's what the guy who did the GMAC said.
Oh, that's a great
That's a
story.
story.
That's a
And he
Pulitzer
said they were
Prize.
working with Howard.
That's a Pulitzer Prize story.
Bring it on.
And you need to watch Michael, because he's gonna try to take it.
Think about that, right?
You need to buy, you have to buy Michael some coffee.
I'm sure. In the back there?
Okay, don't think this one over here.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Something's raised.
Oh, I'm sorry, I don't see her. Oh, I'm
That's
sorry.
okay, I'll wait.
No, Leon is, I follow his advice.
He was my professor.
Oh, got it. I knew this.
I have a very practical question. When you're working on long-term projects and you're also doing shorter stories in the middle, how do you all organize your interviews? Do you transcribe them? Do you log them? How, when you, sometimes at the end, when I finally start writing, I've kind of forgotten some of the good bits, So how do you organize your stuff?
Like for me, my habit is to come back and type up my interviews, and I try to put in bold what felt interesting, and I try to write little notes to myself about whatever my impressions were when I was doing the interview. So that
Right
gives me
after.
right after, because otherwise I forget. So that helps me.
Yeah, I do that too. I also try to find holes, like sometimes I'll interrupt and then the person will be off, like on another subject and they never really finish their story. So I have questions for the next time I'm gonna talk to. But if you wait too long, sometimes you can't read your writing. If you didn't tape it, then you're.
It's labor intensive. I transcribe my own interviews, and that's labor intensive. And I'm very happy I do that, because I now started out with small tape recorders, now I use a digital recorder. I'm very happy I do that, because inevitably I will hear something that I should have pursued. And at the time I was focused over here, and this person said something to the left, and I said, oh, okay, but so-and-so, and I moved the person back to the right. And I said, oh, I should have gone to the left. And I go back to go to the left. I mean, I come right in with that intent. You started to say something, and I pushed you in another direction, but I really want to talk about this particular instance in your life. Yeah. So it's labor intensive. It is.
Yes.
Leon, can you talk a little bit about how you broach those contradictions and deal with them when
Okay.
you're ready to do that?
Sometimes the contradictions are dramatic, some of them are subtle. What I will do, after I do these 4 interviews, then I just do a series of what I call focus interviews, and I'm focused on the contradictions. I'm trying to broaden them out, and I'm trying to put meat on them, because I think here, if this person is willing to talk about this, here is the real person. What I've gotten in the first 4 interviews is mainly the public relations person, the public mask. And then when I come back for the first focus interview, I'll say, you mentioned that your mother got you and your siblings up every morning, and you all went to church every Sunday morning. And each of you were registered in Sunday school, et cetera, et cetera. And then you told me that your father never went. And I didn't understand when I asked you why your father never went, you said he was hungover every morning. What was going on there? Well, she didn't want to tell me that her father was hungover every day. But at this point, she's willing to tell me. Why? Because we've established a relationship. She has come to trust me. She's come to trust, I'm telling you about an actual interview. She's come to trust how I will handle the information, because we talk about that. And I said, well, I think that's significant, because now I understand what you said in the 4th interview. She'll say, what did I say? I said, you went out to pajama parties, but you never invited your girlfriends over to your house for a pajama party. And when I asked you about that, you brushed me off. And she said, yeah, I didn't want my girlfriends coming over there because I didn't know what condition my father would be in. And so so the burden and the impact of the alcoholic father is coming out now. All right? And we may do 3 or 4, many more focus interviews, and sometimes we just have conversations. I'll buy them lunch, and unlike I did for Michael, I'll buy them lunch and dinner. And then they'll really open up. And I say, well, you know what? I'm not recording this, but I'd like to come back and interview you about this because I want to get the detail. And inevitably, they say, yes, okay, the next interview, we'll go back over this material. And inevitably, they add things that are very significant to them about where they are as a result of this lifestyle.
Hey, Norris, I have a question for you, listening to sort of all this talk about meticulous approaches to poverty journalism. As a practitioner now, former journalist, what do you make of the state of coverage of poverty?
I think it's, well, first of all, it's really refreshing to see this conference because for a while there, I think a lot of people wondered if poverty journalism still existed, other than some few examples. I don't think there have been as much of it as there had been. And I think that had to do with the nature of journalism changing so much. There was some discussion in a previous panel about the demise of beat journalism, where at one time every newspaper seemed to have one reporter, at least one reporter, who would focus on covering issues related to poverty, whether it was social issues or education that could focus more on talking about these issues. But I think that there's been sort of a resurgence, even over the last couple of years, or at least that's the way that appears to me. And I don't know, I don't have any data on which to base this, but just the way that it seems to be from someone who pays attention to this from someone outside the field, and someone who is a reader, even though I've been out of journalism for the last 10 years. I'm still a consumer, and it just seems that it's been, the coverage has been diminished dramatically. We don't get the kind of stories that Leon Dash did before, at least not nearly the number of stories that go into these issues in depth. So, but I think there may be some, well, it appears to be some sort of a rising demand and a rising supply of these stories. So it seems like there may be some, at least for now, there's an opportunity. I was sort of encouraged even listening to former President Clinton's speech the other night, because throughout this campaign we didn't hear poverty except when there was some, well, where one side was sort of using it to criticize the current administration's policy. They weren't using it from the standpoint of wanting to help ameliorate the situation or family struggles, but just to criticize other folks. So it was kind of encouraging at least to hear on a national platform the former president mentioning poor kids twice and mentioning poverty at least one other time. So I think that I'm hoping that we will continue to see more of that. Our foundation is going to continue to address those issues and provide the kind of data that will at least give journalists a starting point. And we talked about data before, and I agree that data is not the story. Data can be used to help build the story. They're building blocks. They provide context, but they're not the story. But it does give reporters an opportunity to begin thinking about what issues are important, what's being highlighted, and what issues that are highlighted that we can now take to another level and begin to do the kind of in-depth reporting. So I don't know if I answered your question, but the bottom line is that I think that we've seen sort of, at one time when I started working in newspapers, 30 years ago, I think, that was, my beat was to cover a community in Philadelphia, North Philadelphia. It was just to cover that neighborhood, and so all of my reporting had to do with covering poverty. It was covering families, on welfare, families living in some of the huge housing projects that existed at that time. But I had not seen much of that coverage, even coming down to the last days that I worked in newspapers in 2002.
Can I just bring up, I actually had a question I was hoping to, an issue that I'd like to throw out sort of to the audience and actually to the panel, and it's sort of an ethical thing that is starting to bother me quite a bit in covering this beat, and that's, we spend all this time, getting into these people's lives, and I spend days and days and weeks getting somebody to kind of bare their souls, and then I do a story, and I try and do it as fairly and honestly and accurately as I can. and then we put it out, and we get all these comments on our webpage from people who are unbelievably nasty. And take, you know, why does this woman, first of all, why are they so fat? You know, why do they have children? Why are they whining, even if they're not whining in the piece? And I have gotten to a point that I find it very difficult now when I'm going to approach families and really getting them and to try to develop this relationship. I mean, I have to be honest with them. You are exposing yourself. You could get, you know, people are going to say terrible things that are going to be on the web forever. And I'm just curious if other people have had that same problem, and how do you deal with
Does
it?
NPR make people use their real identity? To me, that's part of it all.
Yeah.
We can monitor comments.
We started to monitor because of this thing. I actually told my editors, I said, I am not going to do this anymore. You know, until somebody starts monitoring these a lot.
Yeah, I cover immigration for the Orange County Register. I had to deal with that all the time. And it's really interesting, it's gotten really, really horrible. And I told my editor, I don't have time to monitor all these comments, you know, this is ridiculous. So what we ended up doing was we ended up going to doing like Facebook comments, and that eliminated some of that nastiness. But still, I mean, it's one of the things that I had to deal with, because there were like even people who are like immigrant activists, some of the dreamers didn't even want to talk with me because they're like, oh, I went to your website and I see those comments. So I had to be very specific. Look, I'm not the person putting these comments. I read the story. I agree with you. I think some of those comments are horrible. And I would just have to tell them, don't read the comments.
That's what I said.
Just when you print out the story, just print out a few pages from the beginning. You know, just don't read the comment. It's been a struggle. It's been very difficult.
Especially Facebook has its own privacy concerns that I won't get into, but I'd like, and then if you're dealing with The Guardian, they love comments. That's a metric for them if you write a piece that you're a popular writer. So the nasty comments, that's fine as far as they're concerned. In fact, I've even had headlines that were misleading in order to stir up controversy in those comments.
I just talk to my subjects too about, before it runs, we just ran a 3-part series on heroin, Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday that I wrote. And so the crux of it was dealing with two mothers. One, her son is about to go to prison for having sold the heroin to the other who died. So I had to sort of navigate the two mothers for several months. And at the end, the night before the second mother's story is to run, she's thinking about pulling out. And I mean, it's laid out, it's on the web. And so that's a phone call that's, you just have to really tell them, and no, I did not put anything in that you told me off the record, even though we've gone over it, because these are grieving people, both of them. And then I always say, you know, and I learned this by getting burned years ago, I can't predict what my readers are going to say. Most readers are really wonderful, but I can't predict it, and somebody might see something in one throw-off quote that I would have never dreamed of. And that could happen to you, and I just want you to be prepared. And it does seem to help.
I think your point about, I'm sorry. No, good. Yeah, I think your point about requiring writers to identify themselves when they post these comments is critical. And I don't know if there's anything we can do about that. At one time, I edited letters to the editor for the Baltimore Sun, and I think that made a huge difference. People were more thoughtful. When you attach your name to something, when you put your credibility on the line, and we would call to verify that they were indeed the letter writer, it makes a difference in terms of the quality of those comments. And so unfortunately, people just seem to have these brain burps, and they don't. They're nasty and they're mean-spirited too often, and there's no accountability. And that's something that is common, but I don't think there's anything with the nature of the business that do anything about it.
You know, one of the things that we all want, though, in the media is we want civic engagement.
Yeah.
We want engagement with the people who read what we write. And so, I mean, Ta-Nehisi Coates, who I think is a great blogger for The Atlantic, wrote a piece about, you know, what do you do about the negative comments? And his standpoint was the egregiously racist, profane, stupid comments. You know, it would be good if you had a monitored comment comments page and people were forced to use their real identity, which would cut down on all of that. But he felt strongly that reporters make a mistake if they just treat the comments page like what he calls a graffiti wall and just want to paint it over and walk past it without looking. And that he advocates in this day and age, where we need the engagement of communities, that if someone takes the time to write a reasoned comment that we may totally think is wrong, but that he will actually enter into dialogue with these people. And I think more reporters who work online are doing that these days. Because sometimes it does bring us closer to the people we're trying to write.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. It's just more, it's more the families, you know, that we essentially are using, you know, to tell a story, I feel.
I guess you understand that.
Yeah, all the way to the back there.
Yeah, when I covered immigration in Spanish, and when my articles are online, there is a lot of comments, but most of the comments are positive. It's like a support community, talking to each other. Oh yeah, I'm familiar with that town, or that's what it means. It's this kind of conversation between immigrants, and it's really nice. But once my articles, it's grabbed by, I don't know, New American media, or mainstream media, and then translate the article into the English language, the comments is just change. All the comments is, you know, against immigrants and go home, and, you know, very nasty comments. And it's kind of interesting how it's the same story. And another thing that happens, even when I cover stories talking about racists or talking about, you know, an attack or somebody shooting immigrants along the border, you know, those kind of shocking stories. The comments are not really aggressive against Americans or against these racist people. It's like, why are they doing this? I mean, because it's the same thing. It's something that I feel like sometimes immigrants don't even appear to express. They're angry, even online. And it changed totally when you have a different reader, different audience.
Yeah, no, I've tried to engage some of those readers. We actually were encouraged to at the register.
Yeah.
And sometimes it worked out, but a lot of the times it
Sometimes
didn't.
not.
You know, because, and I was very cordial and everything, obviously. But it's one of those things where, like, oh, well, you're less than the spectrum, or you're one of them. Okay, so then you just kind of, so then it's just one of those things where, okay, really, is this really the best use of my time? Is it really productive? And I found it not to be productive, on my end at least. I'm like, I would rather spend that time actually reporting stories.
Yeah, I think you've got a lot of cards stacked against you.
Yeah, it's a little tough. I mean, after Facebook it helped, but yeah, so that's why I kind of do see it as graffiti.
Yeah, Linda.
I'm going to change the topic. I'd like to go back to something that, Beth, that you mentioned kind of in passing that I'd actually like to explore a little more, and that's the toll of doing this kind of reporting, because my reporters certainly come back with, you know, the emotional drain of immersing themselves in these stories, and sometimes to the point, often actually, to the point where they get too involved emotionally. So, and you mentioned the Guard Center, which I know about, but I'd like to hear from all of you actually, how you've actually maintained your detachment and what you've done to decompress, because I know it's a really common problem for immersion journalism.
It is. I'll give you an example. The first Christmas in the Adolescent Childbearing Project, all the adolescents bought me Christmas gifts, which I could not accept. And they, nor their parents, understood that I could not accept these gifts. And I had to go through very lengthy discussions with the parents and the adolescents about why I couldn't accept the gift. And the parents insisting that their daughter, their son had gone out and spent their little bit of money to buy me a gift. And so that's very painful. The whole process in all 6 families was very, very painful for me. And gave me, you know, headaches and everything. And then the compromise I worked out, I said, well, you know, the only thing I can do is accept the gift, but I will tell you that I'm taking the gift to Goodwill without ever opening it. So some said, well, go ahead and do that, but take the gift. And others said, no, never mind, I'll give this to someone else. It didn't interrupt the project went on, but it was very painful. The other thing was becoming intimately involved with 6 families that were mired in intergenerational poverty, that had really begun in sharecropping in the South, and had come north to Washington, and then the families were still mired in poverty. I was always trying to figure out what is the silver bullet that could interrupt this process and get them out of the situation. And that would create great headaches, because with each family you were aware of all of the dynamics that were happening, and it wasn't just one dynamic, right? And I don't know that I came up with a solution, but one thing I did conclude, for my own peace of mind, was that if the public school system in poor areas would better serve the poor, then it would go a long way to getting people out of poverty. That was for my own sanity.
I mean, the things, I'll tell one story. When I did this series in public housing in Baltimore, we got pretty close to a family, and one thing that really struck me was just how interconnected all of these issues become. You know, being poor often means poor health, you know, poor outcomes in school, you know, poor options in life. And that's something that almost becomes a bit overwhelming. And, you know, that was one thing, and you know, like Leon said, you know, you kind of ask yourself all along, you know, what if there's one thing I could do, you know, what would it be to change the situation? I couldn't really come up with that one thing, because it felt like the problems are so layered on top of one another and so complex and so intertwined, and that can be a bit of a downer.
Who did you talk about when you were, either of you, like, did you have somebody you could talk to about it?
No, not really. I didn't talk to anyone about it. I was doing it all on my own.
Yeah, I didn't talk to anyone. You can just sort of, you know, absorb it a little bit, you know, and do that. But, and also the thing, and the sensitivity that goes into this kind of journalism. I remember one thing that still sticks in my mind, this is over, you know, 15 years ago, 17, 18 years ago, I did this story. The first part of the series ran on Mother's Day. And I had done this long piece, you know, describing these horrid conditions in this housing project, all the drug dealing, this, that, and the other. It's kind of an overview piece. And there was a scene toward the end of the piece, maybe an 80 or 90-inch story, where I described like a guy who'd been like kind of a neighborhood bad guy, a stick-up guy who had gotten killed some years ago. And I was sort of describing that story, and he had some involvement with some of the main characters in the piece. And on Monday, my voicemail back in those days it was the voice of this guy's mom, you know, sort of saying, the bad guy's mom, you know, saying, you know, I picked up the paper yesterday, and I was amazed to see this long story about the Flag House projects, and I'd grown up there, and I read it, and I devoured this piece. Then I got to the end, and then there's this thing about my son, you know, who had, you know, like I said, been killed, and she claimed that, well, he wasn't a bad guy. Like, you got the story wrong, those court records are not correct. And I was horrified, and that's before like online records, you know. So I'm rushing to the courthouse to double check. And it indeed was him, and I actually copied the record and called her back and said, it's him, but we should talk about this. And I met her for lunch. And, you know, it just became this heart-wrenching thing. She said, well, I knew he had done it, but it was just so painful to read on Mother's Day.
Yeah.
You know, and it was just like, you know, and then I even said, well, did I need to mention? You know, you start wondering whether it was gratuitous, you know, so there's a lot of things that go into this.
So do you bring this stuff home? I mean, how did you deal with your feelings and your emotions that are being, you know, because, you know, one of the things that I have to do as an editor.
I talk about it with my wife, and my wife was, at the time, was a public school teacher, so she talked about it from the other end in a way. And we would just sort of talk about, you know, these situations.
And you're an editor, right? I mean, that's great. I have an editor who actually read my notes if I have a really kind of traumatic interview, help me suss out what the theme should be, and then I can tell her, like, this was really hard. You really put me in a bind, you know, kind of joke, but it brings up the discussion, and I think it's really important. Like, you have to have somebody you can bounce this stuff off of. Like the woman whose son died that I was just talking about, apparently. I had to, you know, we had a relationship, and I left the paper, and and I went on a trip. I was in Portugal this summer, and she asked me if I would light a candle for her son. And which I did. I was in this particular monastery, and yeah, it's something you would have done for a friend if a friend had asked. She wasn't my friend, but we had this relationship. So I then told her that I had done that, and I think that really made her trust me, but it also showed her that I cared, you know? And so I think I would have accepted the gifts, Leon. I mean, I wouldn't have accepted a diamond or anything. We don't, I think we're allowed to accept things up to $25 or something if somebody takes us out to lunch. That's what it used to be, but I don't know. I'm a little looser with the boundaries on that.
I mean, what I do is you know, it definitely gets depressing, and but I just try and keep my eye on the fact that I am telling people stories that nobody else, that nobody will hear if I don't tell them. And every time I get depressed, I just think about that. You know, I think, you know, I need to tell these stories because they're not going to get told. And these people want their stories told. I've found it almost universally. And then the other thing is, as depressing as it can sometimes be, especially when you see how intractable things are, like some of these people that I cover are so amazing. They're extraordinary. They're the most extraordinary people I've ever met in my life, you know, and then, you know, because they have to juggle so many things. They have to be so creative. They get so little reward for just surviving, you know, and so I try and focus on that. And then the other thing is when I go home, I just, you know, go out for a nice meal with my husband. I know
Good
it's
wine,
terrible.
you know?
Honestly,
Bad wine.
I was doing a whole series on hunger, and honestly, every single time I left an interview, I went out and had a good meal. I mean, I know that's weird. I just, you know, that was my way of dealing with it. I don't
Yes,
know.
right there.
It's so refreshing to hear this conversation because I just finished a 2-month piece on older homeless women in San Francisco. I feel like I'm coming down from a mild case of PTSD, really. So it's great to hear this. And Leon, I didn't realize you were the Leon that wrote the book. That story affected me so much as a young person. So that article was incredible in your reporting. But I'm wondering what you all think about what we're facing right now in terms of, you know, we live in this soundbite culture, this sort of celebrity culture. I mean, I was watching MSNBC this morning, and they just, you know, it's policy stuff. It doesn't really affect real people. And if you were all on that show, we would learn so much, right? What are your thoughts about elevating this reporting? Because it's great that you're putting these stories out there, but frankly, they can disappear within 2 days, right? You've got to really work it, and we talked about this in the last session, to really elevate these pieces so they don't die after just a couple days, you know, and you're talking about a couple-week investigation or something that really means something to you.
I mean, I think a well-done story still penetrates kind of all the noise that you have out here. I mean, it comes down to the basics of journalism, I think, you know, despite the different platforms now and all of the cable chatter. I think a good piece, a well-told story, a human story, I think is still compelling. And sort of breaks through. I see, you know, you can see that if you go with the modern metrics. You know, when these stories appear on the Washington Post website, often, not always, but often, they're well-read and much commented upon, and even when they're pretty long. So I think that good work still kind of finds an audience, and that's the bottom line, even though there's much more competition.
I don't think we're going to change the celebrity culture that the media is dominated by. It's been here for a long time. I read something that had started really around the 1920s when celebrity became very important in the media. So I don't think that's going to change. And then there's so many voices. But again, to echo what Michael said, a well-reported story, presented with understanding, some sensitivity, resonates with people. That's what I try to get across to my students. You write about people. People will read these stories if you want to be read. And if you immerse yourself in their lives, then you will understand the dynamics of their lives from the inside. Most people just drive by and they say, look at these people. And they don't have any understanding of how they ended up there, the generations that lived like that for before you, the generation that you go to interview. And that's very important. You know, it's a public record. I don't know that you can do much beyond that.
Well, and there's a certain evergreen quality about the internet for all the bad things that it does in terms of
Yeah, that's
depressing
right.
pay for us.
You have a second and third life occasionally. Let me take the part of ask one question here about